The rain came sideways at Millbrook Cross that afternoon, the way it did most autumns, needling in under the eaves and turning the yard to a brown soup that sucked at every boot. Wood smoke hung low over the chimney pots. Wet wool steamed on the backs of 2 carters, warming themselves at the fire. Underneath both smells sat a third, thinner and better, barley broth, going slow and patient in a black pot that had not stopped simmering in 11 years. The house that made that smell was called the Kettle and Crown, though the crown on the sign had long since flaked to a smear of gilt, and most who passed it only ever noticed the kettle. Nora Fenn kept it. She was the kind of woman an inn-yard forgot the moment she stepped out of it. Not ugly, not pretty. A face made for work, sunburned in summer and chapped in winter, brown hair scraped back under a cap that had been white once. 25 years old, and she had been keeping this house alone for 6 of them, since her father went into the ground and left her his debts along with his door. Her father's rule had been simple, and she had never once broken it. No one hungry left the Kettle and Crown without eating, whether he could pay or not. It was not charity, her father used to say. It was only what a decent house did. It was not a rule that made her rich. The larder that week held 1 sack of barley going soft at the bottom, half a wheel of hard cheese, and a debt to the miller that she had been carrying since Michaelmas. She knew the broth would not last past Thursday. She put another log on the fire anyway, and left the door on its latch, because that was what the house did, and she was the house now. The bell over the door was black iron, worn smooth by 40 years of hands, and it rang thin and cracked instead of clear. It rang that afternoon at 4:30, and what came in on the wet wind was not a carter or a drover or a woman selling eggs. It was a boy. He could not have been more than 8. His coat had been a good coat once, dark green wool, but it hung open over a shirt gone grey with days of wear, and his boots, which were very fine boots indeed, were caked to the ankle in road mud that told her he had walked farther than any boy his age ought to walk alone. He stood just inside the door and did not come further. He did not ask for anything. He only stood there, shaking, with his arms wrapped around himself, staring at the fire like it was the first warm thing he had seen in a long while. Nora had learned not to ask too many questions of a hungry creature before she fed it. Questions could wait. She set down the spoon. "Sit," she said, "by the fire. You'll take a chill standing there dripping." He did not move. "I haven't any money," he said. His voice was very careful, the way a voice is when a child has decided in advance not to cry. "I didn't ask you for any," Nora said. She poured broth into the least chipped of her bowls, the blue one with the crack running through the glaze like a river on a map, and she set it on the table nearest the fire, and she pulled out the bench, and she said nothing further, only stood back the way she would stand back from a stray dog that might yet bolt. He sat. He ate like a boy who had not eaten in 2 days, small fast bites, both hands around the bowl, and when it was empty he looked up at her, as if he expected her to take it away and strike him for having wanted it. She filled it again without a word. The carters at the far table watched with the mild interest of men who had seen the innkeeper feed strangers for nothing more times than they could count, and had stopped remarking on it. One of them went back to his pipe. The rain kept coming. She did not ask him his name. She did not ask him where his people were, though the fineness of the boots and the good cut of the ruined coat told her plainly enough that somewhere someone with money had lost this child, carelessly or cruelly, and that the losing was recent. She only asked when the second bowl was half gone, whether he wanted bread with it, and he nodded, and she cut him bread, and that was all. She did not see the man in the doorway of the smithy across the yard, who had stopped walking the moment he glimpsed the boy through the rain-streaked window of the Kettle and Crown, and who stood there now, with his own coat soaked through, not moving, watching a stranger feed his son a second bowl of broth she could not afford to give away. He was not dressed as anything but a plain travelling man that day. Dark coat, no crest, no ring showing, boots as mud-spattered as the boy's. He had been 3 hours behind his own son, since a groom's error at the crossroads had let the boy slip from the carriage at a change of horses and vanish into a market crowd. And in those 3 hours he had walked the length of 2 villages, asking after a boy in a green coat with his mother's chin, and had begun quietly to be afraid in a way he had not let himself be afraid since his wife died. He watched the woman in the doorway of the Kettle and Crown fill the bowl a second time, and ask for nothing. He did not go in. Not yet. He stood in the rain and watched a stranger do, without being asked, and without being watched. So she believed, the one thing he had spent 3 hours praying someone, anyone, would do for his son. She did not know then that the boy eating her broth was the only child of the Duke of Carrow, the coldest and most feared name in 3 counties, for reasons that had nothing to do with cruelty, and everything to do with a man who had learned, the hard way, never to let his face show what he felt. She did not know that the plain-coated stranger watching her through her own window was that Duke. She only knew that a hungry boy had come in out of the rain, and that her father's rule still held, and that the broth would not last the week regardless. The bell rang again a few minutes later, and this time it was the man. He came in dripping, and he did not go straight to the boy, though Nora saw the look that passed between them, quick and fierce and gone in an instant, the look of a man who has just stopped being afraid. He stood a moment inside the door instead, taking in the room, the fire, the woman with the ladle still in her hand, the way a man takes in a place he intends to remember. "That is my son," he said. "I gathered as much," Nora said. "He's eaten 2 bowls. I'll fetch a third if he wants it. You didn't ask him for payment." "He's a child," Nora said, as though this settled the matter, which to her it did. "I don't ask children for payment. I don't much ask anyone, if it comes to that, not before they've eaten." The man looked at her for a long moment. It was not a look she was used to receiving, and she did not know what to do with it, so she busied herself refilling the bread basket that did not need refilling. "What do I owe you?" he said. "Nothing," Nora said. "He was hungry. I had broth. That's the whole of the reckoning." He set a coin on the table anyway, more coin than the meal was worth by a factor she did not want to calculate, and she pushed it back across the wood without looking at it. "I said nothing," she said, "and I meant it." He did not push the coin a second time. He only looked at her again, that same long, unreadable look, and something in his face moved, so briefly she nearly missed it, like a man filing something away to think about later at length. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," Nora said. "Eat something yourself before you go back out in that. You look worse than the boy." It was not the kind of thing anyone said to a man dressed as well as he was, coat aside, and she saw it land on him strangely, as if no one had told him to eat something in a very long time. He almost smiled. It did not quite arrive. "Thank you," he said again, and this time it meant something different, and she did not know that either. And the bell rang once more behind them as they went back out into the rain, the boy's small hand disappearing into his father's larger one, and the door swung shut, and the fire popped, and the broth went on simmering. and Nora Fenn went back to her ledger and thought no more about it than she thought about any of the dozen small kindnesses she gave away every week, without expecting a thing to come of them. She did not know then that a thing was already coming of it, slow and quiet as water finding the low ground, and that within the month her roof would stop leaking, though she had paid no roofer, and her account at the miller's would stand suddenly and inexplicably clear, and that the man who called himself, when he came back to the crossroads 3 weeks later, only Mr. Reed, was going to keep coming back, under that plain name, until she had told him more of the truth about herself than she had ever told anyone, all the while believing him a stranger of no particular consequence, when he was in fact the most powerful man in the county, and the last person on earth she would ever have thought to open her door to twice. The days after the boy in the rain went by the way most of her days went, one folded into the next, with no seam between them. She did not think of the pair again with any particular attention, only in the way one remembers a bird that flew close and was gone. The larder held, barely. She sold the last of the cheese to a passing peddler, and stretched what remained of the barley thinner than she liked, and told herself, as she told herself most autumns, that winter would either be kind or it would not, and there was no profit in dreading it early. It was the miller who first noticed something was wrong, or right, depending on how a body wanted to look at it. "Your account's clear," he told her, on a Tuesday, not looking up from his scales. "Paid Thursday last, in full." "Paid by whom?" Nora said. Didn't ask his name. Man came through, settled it, said not to trouble you with who. She stood in the mill doorway, turning that over for a long moment, the way she turned over a coin she suspected of being clipped. "That's not usual," she said. "No," the miller agreed. "Bread's usual. This isn't." She thought, briefly and without real conviction, of the fine-coated man from the rainy afternoon, and dismissed the thought, because men who travelled with sons in good green coats and left silver on tables did not, in her experience, come back to quietly settle a stranger's debts a fortnight later, with no name attached. She had met perhaps 3 men of any means in her whole 25 years, who gave anything away without wanting it known, and none of them had been young, and none of them had had a boy's hand folded into theirs at a crossroads inn. She was wrong, though she would not learn it for some time yet. What had in fact happened, in the 3 weeks between the rain and the roof, was this. The Duke of Carrow had ridden the 10 miles back to Carrow Hall, with his son asleep against his shoulder, and had not said a single word to his steward about where he had found the boy, only that he had found him, safe, fed, and warm, at a crossroads house called the Kettle and Crown. He had gone up to the nursery that night, and sat by his son's bed a long while, the way he had not sat by anything in 2 years, and he had thought, with the particular grim attention he gave to things that mattered, about a woman who had fed a filthy strange child 2 full bowls of broth she plainly could not spare, and had refused his coin twice, and had told him, a duke, that he looked worse than his own lost son, and ought to eat something. No one spoke to him that way. No one in 25 years had spoken to him that way, not since his wife, and his wife's plain speaking, he had learnt too late, had been a different animal altogether, all soft words in company, and a cold hand for anyone beneath her notice. He had watched Diana smile at a countess, and cut a housemaid dead in the same afternoon, more times than he cared to count. And he had told himself, in the 2 years since her fever took her, that he had simply misjudged people once, badly, and did not intend to do it twice. He had learned, watching Nora Fenn through a rain-streaked window, to be suspicious of exactly the opposite thing. He had learned to distrust kindness performed in front of an audience. What he had seen at the Kettle and Crown had not been performed for anyone. She had not known he was there. She had not known his son was worth a farthing to a living soul beyond the boy himself. She had fed him because he was cold and hungry, and that, to a man who had spent 2 years believing every soft word he heard was calculated for effect, was the only kind of proof that had ever meant anything. So he had sent his man to settle her account at the mill, with strict instruction that no name be given, and he had told himself it was a small thing. And it was not the last small thing he did. The candlemaker in the next village received, that same month, an unusually large order from an unnamed party, to be delivered at cost to the Kettle and Crown across the winter, no bill to follow. A roofer arrived on a fair Tuesday, said only that his fee was already met, patched 3 bad places over her kitchen, and left before she could properly thank him. She wrote it all down in her ledger under a column she began, half in jest, to label Providence, and did not think to look further than that, because a woman keeping a crossroads inn alone did not, on the whole, expect to be the object of anyone's particular attention, still less a stranger's. The strange man came back himself in the 3rd week, on a clear cold afternoon, riding a good horse he left tied loosely at the post, and he came in under the name Mr. Red, which she had no reason to doubt, and he ordered bread and cheese and sat by the fire a long while, longer than the meal required. "You're a fair way from home, Mr. Red," Nora said, setting his plate down. "I have business in these parts," he said. "Land, tenants, the sort of thing that wants looking at in person now and again. And the boy? Is he well?" Something in his face eased at the question, the way a man's face eases when someone asks after the one thing he has been holding his breath about. "He is well," he said. "He asks after the woman who gave him broth. I told him I would tell you," he asked. "Tell him he's welcome any time," Nora said, "broth or no broth." "Mr." Reed looked at her plate of accounts spread open on the counter, the neat columns, the careful hand, and said, before he seemed to have quite decided to say it, "You keep good books for a house this size." "My father taught me." Said a house that doesn't know what it owes is a house already halfway to owing more than it can pay. Sound thinking. "It's the only kind of thinking that keeps a roof over anyone's head," Nora said, and then, because honesty came to her more naturally than tact, "though someone's been keeping this one over mine lately without my leave, and I'd like to know who, so I can thank them properly and tell them to stop." He did not answer that directly. He looked into the fire instead, and something crossed his face that she read, wrongly, as simple thought about his tenants, and rightly, though she could not know it, as a man deciding how much longer he could go on not telling her a very large lie by omission. "Some debts," he said carefully, "are better left unpaid to the person who paid them. It spares everyone the awkwardness of thanks. That's a strange way to think of kindness. Is it? Kindness that hides its face isn't hiding out of modesty, in my experience," Nora said. "It's hiding because it wants something it's ashamed to ask for, outright." He looked at her then, sharply, and for a moment she thought she had offended him, and then she saw that she had not, that he was only turning her words over the way he turned over everything, weighing them for truth. "Or," he said slowly, "because the kindness was never meant to be a transaction at all. Because the moment a person knows who to thank, they start weighing what they owe. And some things aren't meant to be weighed." Nora considered that. "That's a fine thought," she said, "for a man who won't tell me his tenants' names either." He almost smiled. It nearly arrived the way it had the first day, and did not quite land, but it was closer this time, and she found she had noticed the closeness, and did not entirely know what to do with having noticed it. He came again the following week, and the week after that, always Mr. Reed, always land business that kept him vague on particulars, always sitting longer than any land business required. She found she looked for his horse at the post before she admitted to herself she was looking. She told herself it was only that he paid well and never haggled and always asked after her stock as if her stock were a thing worth asking after, which no one else in Millbrook Cross ever thought to do. It was on one of those afternoons, with the boy along this time, sitting close to the fire with a picture book Nora did not ask where he'd gotten, that she first heard the boy call him something other than Mr. Reedy Papa. The boy said, tugging his sleeve, "May I have the seed cake?" Mr. Reedy's whole body went very still. "You may," he said, and then, to Nora too quickly, "He calls me that." "It's a habit of his. He's your son," Nora said, mild. "I'd think it strange if he didn't." "Yes," he said, "of course." She noticed the stillness. She filed it away, the way she filed away most things she did not fully understand, and did not press it, because pressing was not in her nature, and because the boy was already halfway through the seed cake and telling her, with the total confidence of an 8-year-old, that her broth was the best broth in England, better than anything the cook at home made, and that he intended to marry her when he was grown unless she objected. "I'll consider the offer," Nora told him gravely, "though you may find someone nearer your own age by then." The boy laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, and Mr. Reed watched his son laugh with an expression Nora could not read at all, something that looked almost like grief, wearing the coat of happiness, and she thought, not for the first time, that there was a great deal about this quiet, careful, land-minded stranger that did not add up the way sums in a ledger were meant to add up. She did not know then that the sum she could not make balance was a duke's whole life, folded small enough to fit at her fireside under a false name, and that the folding could not go on much longer, because a man cannot keep a title hidden forever in a county where everyone else knows his face, and that the reckoning, when it came, was going to arrive not gently, and not from him, but from a woman who had never once in her life given anything away without wanting the world to see. Her give it. Winter closed in hard that year, the way it always threatened to and mostly did not, except that year it did. The road out of Millbrook Cross froze to iron ruts by December, and trade thinned to the few carters desperate enough to risk their horses' legs on it, and Nora kept the fire built up past what she could afford in wood, because a cold house was a house nobody stopped at, and a house nobody stopped at was a house that starved. Mr. Reed came anyway, through the worst of it, on a horse that grew steadily more impatient with the ice, and stayed longer each time, and Nora had stopped pretending to herself that she did not watch for him. He was not, she had decided by then, a handsome man in the way the word was generally meant. His nose had been broken once, and set slightly wrong. His face ran to hard planes rather than soft ones, and he almost never smiled, and when he did it looked like something wrung out of him against considerable resistance. But he listened when she spoke, as though what she said mattered enough to be listened to, which she had not experienced from any man before, gentry or otherwise. And he was patient with the boy, in a way that told her plainly he had learned patience the hard way, through some grief she had not yet been told the shape of. She learned a little of that shape on an evening in January, when the boy had fallen asleep by the fire over his book, and the two of them sat on either side of the hearth, in the particular quiet that comes after a house has gone half dark. "You've never mentioned his mother," Nora said. She had not meant to say it. It came out anyway, plain, the way most things came out of her. Reed was quiet long enough that she thought he would not answer. "She died," he said. 2 winters past. A fever. I'm sorry. Don't be. Not on my account." He looked into the fire. She was a great beauty. Everyone said so. She could charm a room of 40 people into thinking her the kindest woman alive, and in the same evening she would have a servant turned out into weather like this for spilling wine on her hem, and feel nothing about it at all. I did not see that for the first 3 years. I saw it very clearly for the last 2. That's a hard thing to learn about a person you're bound to. It taught me something useful, at least, he said. It taught me that a person's true measure isn't what they do when the room is watching. It's what they do when they believe no one of any consequence can see them at all. Everyone can be gracious to a countess. Very few people are gracious to a scullery maid who can do nothing for them in return. He glanced at her, briefly, and looked away again. "I've come to think that's the only test worth trusting." Nora sat with that a moment. "That's a hard way to go through the world," she said. "Testing everyone. It's a safer way," he said, "than the one I used before." She did not know, hearing it, that he had already tested her, weeks ago, in the rain, without her ever knowing there was an examination underway, and that she had passed it so completely he had not been able to stop thinking about her since. She only knew that something had passed between them just now, that felt larger than the words carrying it, and she banked the fire a little higher and did not ask him anything further, because some things, she had learned, were better let settle in their own time. It was not long after that evening that Lady Augusta Vale first came to Millbrook Cross, and everything that had been settling quietly for 3 months came apart in the space of one bad afternoon. Lady Augusta was the sister of the late Duchess, and she had appointed herself, in the 2 years since her sister's death, the chief authority on how the Duke of Carrow ought to be raising his son, how he ought to be spending his winters, and whom he ought, eventually, to be marrying, a list on which a crossroads innkeeper did not appear, and would not have appeared, Lady Augusta made plain, if the entire county had been searched twice over. She arrived at the Kettle and Crown in a carriage far too fine for the ice-rutted road, with a maid and a hot brick for her feet. And she came in without waiting to be asked, and she looked at the low smoky room and the chipped crockery, and the woman behind the counter with an expression Nora had seen before. On the faces of people who believed poverty was a kind of moral failing best remarked upon aloud. "So this," Lady Augusta said, to no one in particular, "is where he has been wasting his afternoons." "Can I help you, my lady?" Nora said, because the fine carriage told her plainly enough what to call her. "You can tell me," Lady Augusta said, "what precisely you imagine you are doing, feeding suppers to a duke and calling it hospitality, when any woman with eyes can see it for what it is." "I sell suppers," Nora said, "to anyone who's hungry and has the coin, and sometimes to those who haven't. That's the whole of my trade." "Charming," Lady Augusta said. "And the Duke, does he pay for his suppers, or has he found other currency more to your taste?" Nora set down the cloth she had been folding, very carefully, and did not answer at once, because she had learnt long ago that an answer given too quickly was an answer given in anger, and anger, in her experience. Never won an argument with a woman like this one. "He pays," she said finally, "same as anyone." How touchingly literal. Lady Augusta looked her over, slowly, from her chapped red hands to her patched hem to her plain scraped hair, with the particular thoroughness of a woman totalling a column of figures she already knew came to nothing. You do understand what you are. A woman who boils barley for carters. He is a duke. There are perhaps a dozen women in England whose blood is fit to stand beside his, and you, my dear, own a kettle and a debt to the miller, which I imagine is common knowledge in a village this size, and neither of those is a dowry. The room had gone very quiet. The two carters by the far wall had stopped eating. Nora did not cry. She had trained herself out of that a long time ago, out of necessity more than pride, because a woman who wept in front of customers did not keep customers long, and tears never once paid a debt. She felt her hands want to shake, and she pressed them flat against the counter until they stopped. "I never asked to stand beside him, my lady," she said, "and I'll thank you not to speak of my debts as though you'd come to settle them. I keep an honest house. I've never once asked your nephew, or your duke, or anyone else, for a farthing more than a meal is worth. If that's a crime in your eyes, you'll have to find a magistrate, because I don't believe there's a law against feeding hungry men at a fair price." "There ought to be a law," Lady Augusta said, "against ambition dressed up as charity." "Then you'll want to look elsewhere for it," Nora said, "because there's none of that here. Only broth, and bread, and a fire that's warmer than the one in your carriage, I'd wager, seeing as you've kept your maid standing in the cold this whole conversation." It was a small thing, that last line, and it landed harder than a larger one might have, because Lady Augusta had indeed left her maid shivering by the door the entire time. And the girl's face went carefully blank in the particular way of servants who have just watched someone say the thing they were forbidden to say themselves. Lady Augusta's mouth thinned. "You are impudent." "I'm plain," Nora said. "There's a difference, and I'd have thought a woman of your breeding would know it." The door opened before Lady Augusta could answer, and the cold that came in with it was nothing compared to the cold that had already settled over the room. Mr. Reed stood in the doorway, still in his plain travelling coat, and Nora saw, in the half-second before anyone spoke, the exact moment his face changed from ordinary weariness to something flat and dangerous, the look of a man who has walked in on a thing he will not forgive quickly. "Augusta," he said. Lady Augusta's whole posture altered, softened, arranged itself for an audience, the way a woman's posture only arranges itself when she has just realised the audience has changed. "Julian, I was merely explaining to this person. I heard what you were explaining," he said. "From the yard." The name went through Nora like cold water down the back of a collar. Julian, not Mr. Red. She stood very still, the way she stood still when a pot was about to boil over and there was nothing to be done but watch it happen. "You will apologise to Miss Fenn," he said, "and you will do it now, or you will leave this house and this county, and we will not speak again this year." "You cannot mean to defend her, I mean," he said, very quietly, in a voice Nora had never once heard him use, "that I have watched this woman feed a starving child 2 bowls of broth she could not spare, and refuse payment for it twice. I have watched her keep honest books in a house that would have failed a lesser woman inside a year. I have not, in 2 years, watched you do a single kind thing for anyone who could not afterward be useful to you. You will apologise, Augusta, or you will go." Lady Augusta did not apologise. She gathered her skirts and her shivering maid, and left in a silence so total that even the fire seemed to hold its crackle, and the carriage wheels crunched away over the ice, and the room breathed out. Nora looked at him. "Julian," she said. "Yes, not Mr. Reid, no," he said. "And the boy." "Papa," she said slowly, Putting the pieces down one by one the way she set figures in a ledger column isn't just any man's son. He did not answer that. He did not need to. She had already answered it herself, out loud, in the quiet that followed, and she watched his face and understood, with a cold, clean certainty that had nothing warm in it at all, that the man she had fed broth to for 4 months under a false name was the Duke of Carrow, and that he had let her believe otherwise the entire time. She did not cry then either. She only untied her apron, very slowly, and folded it, and set it on the counter, the way a person sets down a thing they have decided not to pick up again. "I think," she said, "you had better go too." The house was very quiet after they had gone. Both of them, Duke and aunt alike, off down the same frozen road in different directions, and Nora Fenn stood behind her counter a long while, with her hands flat on the wood, not moving. The way she had taught herself to hold still when moving would only let something spill. She was not angry, precisely, or she told herself she was not, because anger required a right to have expected better, and she had never had any right to expect anything from a duke beyond the price of his supper. What she felt instead sat lower than anger, a cold, quiet, sinking thing. The particular grief of discovering that a person she had begun, without quite noticing it happen, to trust completely had built the whole of their acquaintance on a lie he had chosen, deliberately, night after night, not to correct. She thought of every evening by the fire, every question she had answered honestly, about her father, her debts, her fears for the coming winter, believing she spoke to a plain man of modest land business who had no particular power over her life, when in fact she had been speaking, the whole time, to a man who could have ruined the Kettle and Crown with a single word to the right creditor, or saved it with a single word to the same man, and had chosen instead to sit at her hearth under a false name and let her believe herself equal to a conversation that had never once been equal. She did not weep. She banked the fire, low, the way she banked it every night, and went to bed, and lay a long while listening to the windwork at the shutters, and told herself, with the particular firmness of a woman who has had a great deal of practice telling herself things, that it did not matter, because nothing had truly happened between them beyond broth and bread and land business that had never been land business at all. The following week brought the second blow, and it came, as these things generally did in Millbrook Cross, dressed as ordinary business. Squire Talbot's man came round on the Tuesday with a note in his hand and an apologetic look on his face, the look of a man sent to do an unpleasant errand he had not chosen. The note said, in dry legal language that Nora read twice to be sure she had understood it correctly, that the mortgage her father had taken against the house 11 years past, and which she had believed settled by the mysterious hand of Providence some months earlier, had in fact only been quietly bought up by a new holder, and that the new holder was calling it due, in full, within the month. "Whose hand is this?" Nora asked, though she already suspected, with a sick lurch, whose hand it must be. "Can't say, Miss Fenn," the man said, "only that it's called improper and legal, and you've a month to find the sum or find other arrangements." She sat with the note a long while after he'd gone. She had thought, all these months, that the clearing of her debts had been an act of ordinary kindness from an unnamed benefactor, a piece of luck she did not deserve, and had stopped questioning too closely, because questioning it too closely felt like tempting it away. She understood now, with the particular bitterness of a woman realizing she has been managed rather than helped, that every quiet debt paid, every roof tile mended, every candle delivered at no charge, had been the Duke's hand all along, buying her comfort a piece at a time without ever once telling her whose comfort it was, and that now, having been caught in one lie, he had perhaps decided to call in the whole of his secret ownership at once, whether from spite or from some plan of his own she could not begin to guess. It was not true, though she had no way yet of knowing that. It was Lady Augusta's man, not the Duke's, who had bought the note, on Lady Augusta's own money and her own initiative, with the express intention of forcing the woman who had humiliated her out of the county inside a month, and she had done it quietly enough that even the Duke did not yet know his aunt had moved against Nora at all. But Nora did not know any of that either, not yet, and so she sat with the note in her lap and felt the whole quiet architecture of the winter collapse into something that looked, from where she sat, exactly like betrayal doubled over on itself. She did not send word to Carrow Hall. She told herself there was nothing to send word about, that a woman did not go begging a Duke's mercy over a debt he had likely arranged to call in himself, out of some cold aristocratic lesson about knowing one's place. She closed the Kettle and Crown's door to Mr. Reed, or the Duke of Carrow, or whatever name he cared to answer to, in the plainest way she knew, by telling the boy from the smithy who ran messages between the crossroads and the hall that if a certain gentleman came asking after her, he was to be told she was not receiving callers, and had no wish to be called upon again. It was Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper at Carrow Hall, who first heard of the note 3 days later from her own sister, who did the wash for Squire Talbot's household and had a loose enough tongue at the right moment. Mrs. Pruitt had kept Carrow Hall for 11 years. She had kept a great many secrets in that time, most of them small, some of them large, and she had come, over the years, to think of the Duke less as her employer, and more as a boy she had watched grow into a hard, careful, grieving man, and she loved him the particular fierce way a servant sometimes loves a master they have known too long to be properly deferential about. She found him in his study that evening, going over accounts with the flat, joyless attention he gave to anything since the woman at the crossroads had stopped answering his calls. "Your Grace," she said, "might I speak plainly? You always do, Mrs. Pruitt. I've never found a way to stop you. It's about Miss Fenn." His pen stopped moving. Her mortgage has been called in, bought up quiet and called due inside the month, and I think, Your Grace, though I can't swear to it yet, that it wasn't your doing at all, and that she believes it was. He was very still for a long moment. Why would she believe that? Because, Mrs. Pruitt said, not unkindly, you let her believe a great many things these 4 months past that weren't strictly true, and a woman who's just learned one large lie doesn't generally stop at believing only the one. She'll believe the worst of the rest, because the worst is easier to carry than the hope that maybe not everything was false. He set down his pen. "I never called in that note. I know that, Your Grace. She doesn't. Then she must be told." "She won't hear it from your mouth just now," Mrs. Pruitt said. "Not yet. She's shut her door to you, and I'd wager she means it. But she might hear it from someone who's never lied to her at all." She paused. "I could go to her myself. I've a mind to tell her a few other things while I'm there, if your Grace will permit it." He looked at her a long moment, and something in his face, tired and grim as it had been for a week, eased very slightly, the particular ease of a man realizing he is not entirely without allies in a fight he has badly mismanaged. "Tell her whatever true thing you think will serve," he said. "I am done managing this from a distance. I have made a hash of it, managing it up close as well, but at least let the account be an honest one. Mrs. Pruitt went to Millbrook Cross the following morning, on foot, because the ice made the carriage road treacherous, and she was not a woman to let ice stop her when her mind was set. She found Nora scrubbing a pot that did not need scrubbing, the particular fierce cleaning of a woman working off a feeling she has no other outlet for. "I've not come to plead his case," Mrs. Pruitt said, by way of greeting, "so you needn't look at me like that. I've come to tell you a few facts, and you may do what you like with them after. I've no quarrel with you, Mrs. Pruitt, no. But you've a very large quarrel with the man who sent me, and I'll not pretend he doesn't deserve some of it. He should have told you who he was the first week, not the 4th month. That was cowardice dressed up as caution, and I told him so myself, though I don't suppose it eased anything for you to hear it after the fact." She sat, uninvited, at the nearest bench, the way a woman sits who intends to stay until she has finished saying her piece. "But I'll tell you what he didn't send me here to tell you, because he's too proud and too careful to say it himself, and someone ought to. Go on, then. The roof that got mended without a bill. That was him. The account at the mill cleared without a name. Him. The candle order at cost all winter. Him. The physician he sent to old Mrs. Idden's boy in December, when the boy had the croup, and no one in this village could afford to fetch a doctor from town, and the boy lived because of it, and not a soul knows to this day who paid for that either, because he asked, every single time, that his name never be given. Mrs. Pruitt's voice, dry and brisk as it was, softened at the edges. "That is not the behaviour of a man managing a woman for sport, Miss Fenn. That is the behaviour of a man who has been quietly, clumsily, and very thoroughly in love with you since a rainy afternoon in autumn, and who has been terrified the entire time that the moment you learned his name, you would stop looking at him the way you look at ordinary men, and start looking at him the way that woman who came here last week looks at everyone. He would rather you never knew any of it than risk that." Nora sat very still, and the mortgage, Mrs. Pruitt went on, was not his doing. "I'd stake my place on it. I think you'll find, if anyone troubles to look, that it was Lady Augusta's money that bought that note, not his, and that she did it out of spite for the tongue-lashing you gave her in this very room, and that he doesn't yet know it's been done at all." Nora looked down at her red chapped hands, folded together in her lap, and did not answer for a long moment. "He should have told me," she said finally, "the very first week. I'd have understood a duke wanting to be looked at plainly, without his title standing in front of him like a wall. I could have understood that. What I can't forgive so easily is being made a fool of for 4 months running, and finding it out from his own aunt instead of his own mouth." "No, Mrs." Pruitt agreed. "You shouldn't have to forgive that easily. I'd think less of you if you did." She stood, straightening her skirts. "But don't mistake the lie for the whole of the man, Miss Fenn. Some men lie to take. He lied, badly, to give, and to keep on giving without ever being thanked for it, because being thanked to a man raised the way he was felt like being paid, and he did not want to be paid for loving you. He wanted, God help him, only to love you plainly, the one thing he apparently has no notion how to do without making a hash of it first." She left Nora sitting by the fire with that, and the cracked blue bowl on the shelf above her, and the black bell silent over the door, and a great deal to think about that had not been there an hour before. The month the mortgage note allowed her ran out on a Thursday, and Nora Fenn spent every day of it not sending word to Carrow Hall, out of a stubbornness she recognised in herself and did not entirely regret, and the Duke of Carrow spent every one of those same days learning, piece by piece through his own steward's quiet inquiry, exactly what his aunt had done, and containing a fury about it that he had not felt in 2 years. Since the last time he had discovered a cruelty dressed up in fine manners, and had been powerless then to do anything about it in time. He was not powerless now. He bought the note back from Lady Augusta's man himself, at a considerable premium, on the condition that it be marked satisfied in full and never mentioned to Miss Fenn as having been in any danger at all. And he sent his aunt, by the same post, a letter so cold and so final that Mrs. Pruitt, who read it over his shoulder before it went out because she had earned the right to, said only that she had never once, in 11 years, seen him put quite that much winter into a single page. But the note satisfied was not, he understood, the same thing as an apology given, and an apology given was not the same thing as trust rebuilt, and he had learned enough these 2 years past, from watching a beautiful woman charm 40 people and ruin one, to know that trust was not a debt a man could simply pay off from a distance with silver. It had to be handed back the same way it had been taken, in person, plainly, with nothing standing between him and the person he owed it to. He went to the Kettle and Crown on the last evening of that month, in the worst weather the winter had yet produced, snow coming down hard and dry and blowing sideways off the fields, and he came this time in his own coat, with his own crest on the carriage door, and he did not send a boy ahead to ask leave to call. The bell rang, cracked and thin as ever, and Nora looked up from behind her counter and saw him standing in her doorway, snow melting on his shoulders, no title in his bearing at all, only a tired man who had walked the last quarter-mile from where his carriage had stuck in a drift. And she did not tell him to leave. She did not tell him to stay, either. She only stood there, and he stood there, and the fire cracked. And outside the wind worked at the shutters the way it had worked at them the night she learned his name. "I came to tell you the mortgage is settled," he said. "It was never mine to begin with. It was Augusta's doing, out of spite, and I have bought it back and burned the note, and you will hear nothing further of it from anyone." "Thank you," Nora said, carefully, the way a person thanks someone for a fact rather than a favour. "I did not come only to tell you that." "No," she said, "I didn't think you had." He looked at the fire a moment, gathering himself the way she had watched him gather himself before difficult things all winter, and then he looked back at her, and there was nothing careful left in his face at all. "I wanted to see," he said, "the first day, in the rain, who you were when you believed no one of any consequence was watching. That is the only test I have ever trusted since my wife died, because it is the only one that cannot be performed for an audience. You fed my son because he was cold and hungry, and you asked nothing, and you did not know I stood in the smithy doorway across the yard the whole time, watching. I have never in my life seen anyone pass that test as completely as you passed it that afternoon, and I have been a coward ever since, hiding behind a false name, because I was more afraid of you looking at me the way the world looks at a duke than I was of anything Augusta has ever said to my face." Nora did not answer at once. Her hands on the counter were very steady, which surprised her, because she had expected them to shake. "You let me talk to you for 4 months," she said, "about my debts, and my fears, and my father, believing I spoke to a man of no particular power over my life. That wasn't only shyness. Julian, that was a lie, told over and over, by omission. Every single evening you sat at that fire and let me go on believing it." "Yes," he said, "it was. I have no defence for it beyond the truth, which is that I was afraid, and fear makes cowards of men who ought to know better. And I knew better, and I did it anyway, and I am sorry for every evening of it. I don't want an apology that only counts the evenings, Nora said. I want to know it won't happen again. Not about this, not about anything. If you ever come to this door again, I want the truth of you standing in it, whatever that truth costs either of us. And I don't want to learn it second-hand from your aunt in front of 2 carters and a serving girl. You have it, he said, every day of it, for as long as you'll have me standing in this doorway at all. That's a large promise for a man to make on a snowy doorstep. It's the only kind I intend to make you from now on. Nora looked at him a long moment, weighing that the way she weighed everything. Slowly, honestly, without wanting to be rushed into a good feeling before she had tested it for weight. I won't be rescued, she said finally. I won't be some tale you tell yourself about the good you did once, at a crossroads when you were lonely. If you want me, you'll want the woman who scrubs pots and keeps a ledger, and speaks plainer than any duchess you've ever met, not a debt you feel obliged to settle. I don't want to settle a debt, he said. I have never once thought of you as a debt. I think of you as the only honest hour of my day, in a life that has otherwise been very carefully managed by everyone around me since the day I was born. He paused. I am not asking you to answer me tonight. I will not press you for a yes you haven't had time to be sure of. I would rather have your no, freely given, months from now, than your yes tonight, because you felt the weight of my rank standing behind it. Take the winter, take the spring if you need it. I will come back in April, and I will ask again, and whatever you tell me, I will accept it as the true answer, because a free no means more to me than a yes given out of gratitude or fear ever could. Nora looked at him for a long moment, snow still melting slowly from his shoulders onto her clean floor, and something in her chest, which had been held very tight for a month, came loose all at once. You needn't wait until April, she said. Nora, I said what I said about honesty, and I meant every word of it, and you'll hold to it, or I'll know the reason why. But I don't need a season to know my own mind. I knew it the first week you sat at that fire, under a false name, and I have been angry with myself ever since for knowing it anyway. She untied the strings of her apron, slowly, and set it on the counter the way she had the day she learned his name. Only this time it was not a gesture of dismissal. Ask me properly. Not a duke asking a favour of a poor woman. A man asking a woman a plain question. He crossed the room. He did not take her hand at once. He looked at it first, red and chapped and steady, not shaking at all, and he said, "Lo, will you marry me?" Not the Duke of Carrow. Only Julian, who has no notion how to say a thing plainly and is trying to learn. Yes, Nora said. It was the only word she needed, and she found she did not have to search for it at all. He took her hand then, both of his own around it, and drew off, very slowly, finger by finger, the warm glove she still wore even indoors from years of chapped winters, and set it aside, and pressed his mouth, once, to her bare knuckles, and did not let go of her hand after that, not for a long while, and neither of them minded the fire burning low, or the snow piling against the door, because for the first time in either of their lives there was nowhere either of them would rather have been. "Thank you," she said into the quiet. "For what? For coming back in the snow instead of waiting for fair weather?" "Thank you," he said, "for not making me wait until April." They were married in the spring, quietly, in the small stone church at Millbrook Cross, rather than the grand chapel at Carrow Hall, because Nora had asked for it plainly, and he had refused her nothing that spring, and the whole of the parish came. Carters and millers, and the boy from the smithy who had carried messages between them all winter, and Mrs. Pruitt cried through the entire service, and did not pretend otherwise afterward. Lady Augusta Vale was not among the guests. She had been sent, by the time the banns were read a third time, to a small dower cottage on a distant Carrow property near the northern border, with an allowance sufficient for comfort, and a letter from her nephew making plain that she was welcome to visit Carrow Hall again, only when she had learned to speak of the poor the way she wished the world to speak of her. She wrote once that autumn to ask forgiveness in terms so grudging that Mrs. Pruitt, reading it aloud at the Duchess's request, burned it in the grate before she finished the second page, and no one in the household thought that judgment too harsh. The Kettle and Crown did not close. Nora would not hear of it closing, and Julian, to his credit, never once suggested it should, understanding by then that the house was not merely her livelihood, but the truest room she had ever kept, the one place where the whole of her character had first been seen and understood for exactly what it was. She kept the ledger herself still, some afternoons, when the Duchess's other duties allowed it, and the bell over the door rang just as thin and cracked as it ever had, and no hungry traveller who came through it was ever turned away, whatever the Duchess's other engagements that week. Because that had been her father's rule, and it was hers now, and a rule like that did not change simply because the woman keeping it had married a duke. Old Mrs. Idden's boy, the one the physician had saved that anonymous December, grew up straight and strong and went, at the Duke's quiet expense, to a good school, and never learned until he was a man grown, whose hand had paid for either the doctor or the schooling, because that was a habit Julian had never broken, only shared now with a wife who understood exactly why he kept it. A year to the day after the snow on the doorstep, they sat together by the fire at Carrow Hall, the boy Peter grown a full head taller, and sprawled on the hearthrug with a dog Nora had brought from the crossroads, because it had shown up starving at her door one November, and she had not had it in her to turn it away, testing, as it turned out, the family the same way its mistress once had, choosing the fireside because it saw what waited there, and knew it for safety. Julian took her hand as the last light went out of the window, bare fingers laced through bare fingers, and neither of them let go, not when the fire popped, not when Peter laughed at something the dog did, not when the frost began its slow climb up the glass the way it had the night they met. A house that feeds a stranger without asking who he is will one day discover it has fed its own future without knowing it either, and the world, in its own slow and just time, always finds a way to pay that kindness back.